All right. Whew. Finally. Praise the Lord. Welcome to Arkway Ministries Church. I apologize for not being here on time. I had some technical difficulties with my computer. Been having a lot of technical difficulties lately. But I'm glad to be here again with you, going through the Word of God. Again, this is Bible class. We are still going through the book of Acts in a historical manner. So I'm probably going to, tonight, I'm definitely going to do a little bit more on the history that's going to be denoted in this time period of Acts 12. We're going to be talking about Peter and his experience in prison and the time period for reference of the death of Herod and which Herod it was and what was the significance of that event. So let me get my documentation up here ready to go, both my Excel spreadsheet and my Word document. And we will begin in a second. Like I said, I had sort of a rocky start. I think my machine did a couple of Windows updates, and I know it was pending for a long time, so it must have done it while I was away in sleep, and that's a worst time to do Windows updates. So I apologize for the late start. So I'm not going to keep you late tonight. Just to give you what I have, and then I'll try and move along quickly through this, meaning I won't talk too much. But I'm going to try and make it very interesting. Okay, so here's where we're at on the history wheel to give us reference. We already have had in Acts chapter 11, the drought that was to come and the rush of everyone in the north to the lower areas of the Damascus area. And we found everyone sort of huddled in Caesarea, where most of the people that escaped Damascus went to, avoiding the war between Herod and the king of Damascus. And by the way, this gives us a historical reference period of roughly about, this would be about 54. All right, it's about Aristobulus of Caucasus. So this is about when Herod was slain, so about 51, 54, around that time period. Between 55, 56, Aristobulus took over as Herod. So the previous Herod, which would have been Herod of Caucasus, he, as Herod, was the person who reigned during the time when Barnabas was going to Antioch and Agabus was coming down, and the battles were happening between Herod Agrippa, and the king of Damascus. And that happened at about 36 AD when that stuff kicked in. And then Herod of Caucasus took over from Herod Agrippa. So it's more than likely, maybe a little bit earlier. I'm sorry. That would have been, Herod of Caucasus. Yeah, I'm right. I'm still good. Aristobulus. And that was about 51, 54. So we are getting close to the period of time where we're going from the 40s to the 50s. And I'm going to try and give us the time period that's happening between Herod of Caucasus when he took over from Herod Agrippa. So Herod Agrippa was appointed by Claudius, Emperor Claudius, in about 41 to 54. or excuse me, Claudius was reigning. So about maybe 41, 41 is when Claudius raised Herod Agrippa up. And Herod and Claudius were very good friends. Um, After the battle that Herod fought against the king of Damascus for what he had done, um, the Emperor Claudius decided to intervene on Herod's behalf and initiate a decree to capture the king of Damascus. Um, but Herod Agrippa had been slain in about maybe 43 AD, and Herod of Caucasus, he took over as the primary Herod after that. Um, this all occurs about 44 AD, 44, 45 AD. And we have the event here in Acts 12 about maybe 44 AD. Okay, so Acts 12 is occurring in about 44 AD. It's after the prophecy of famine and the war that was occurring in the north, and everyone that left from the north and went down to the south into Jerusalem and receiving support from the Christians. All right, so this all happened about maybe 43, 44 AD. All right, so now we're into Acts 12, 1 and 2. And that's the history, that portion of it. So we're going to continue forward and let us move a little bit further. Let me get my books ready and then we can kick into it. All right. It's 12. I didn't have all this stuff together. I was looking at my notes. Excuse me. All right. So now we're in Acts 12, 1 through 4. And it says, now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. Okay. And he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. Now, James dies historically in about the year, 44 AD. Okay. So at about 44 AD, James, who had established the Nazarenes. So James was a leader of the Nazarenes, or the Nazarite Jews. They were a Hellenistic Jewish group that were more Jewish than anything. If I were to try to equate that group to anything that exists now, it would be the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were more like Nazarenes than anything, minus the extreme Judaism that they practice in the Nazarene cult of Judaism. So they were a Jewish Gnostic group that were more Jewish than Gnostic, but yet and still they still had certain things that were still very Gnostic. And I would equate that type of a setup in that group based upon their behaviors, the practices that made them what they were to what we know of as Jehovah's Witnesses, so to speak. I'm not saying that Jehovah's Witnesses are Nazarenes. I'm just saying they're pretty close to one another. Okay. A lot of the early churches are pretty close to the Jehovah's Witnesses concept. That's just what they do. They practice a lot more closer. So aid was sent to Jerusalem. Herod executes James, brother of James, about maybe 44 AD. And that's 1 and 2. And then because he saw it pleased, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. Okay. And so this is sort of a very interesting little entry. The days of unleavened bread, or when there's no joy or mirth, but all of it's a holy space. It's God doing work. And so individuals are being chastised and being called together and hunted down. And there's no joy. It's just all fear and pain and running for your lives. And this is where that Gospel of Mark in the end point begins to talk about the days when they were struggling and struggling. This is where they're talking about in that the Gospel of Mark. And so this is Peter, therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. Okay. And when Herod would have brought him forth, the same night Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. Now, I want to explain something, go up a little bit further. Back in the history, about 12 and 3. Remember I told you that there was a Herod change. Now remember, Herod is a title. The person that holds the Herod title can change interactively quite often, and it did. But Herod was sort of a callback to Herod the Great. In other words, I'm another Herod the Great, but my name is such and such. And so that title, Herod, became the mantle. Just like Cyrus was a title, Darius was a title, Abimelech was a title. Many people held it. Pharaoh was a title. Many people hold the title throughout generations in history, but the title always remains. And so that's pretty much how it kind of works in the ancient world. This is no different. Ptolemy was a title, and then there were different Ptolemies in the Ptolemy dynasty. But you get the idea. And because he saw it please the Jews, right? So this is the new Herod coming in, and the old Herod being ushered out. Okay. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Stop. Okay, there was no Easter. This means that this gives us a very interesting view into the writing, or at least the interpretation of the writing at the time when it was written or edited. So we see here, I don't know if your Bible has it meaning Easter. You know, in some Bibles, it's more like Passover. Most of the Jewish Bibles, Hellenistic Jewish Bibles, I think it's the Hebrew roots. They would have called it Passover. We had the Feast of Unleavened Bread earlier. These are days of unleavened bread. So this is the Passover coming, right? So this is the Passover piece coming. This is the Passover time. This is that point, that moment in time throughout the year. So we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which normally comes after Passover, but this is short of saying that that the Feast of Unleavened Bread and then the Passover in the sequence of events, as in the retelling of it. But it's not that way. The Feast of Unleavened Bread comes after the Passover celebration night, which is one night. You have first the Feast of the Firstborn, then the Passover, and then you have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day festival. And in that festival, you have certain things that occur. Here we have them calling the whole day or the whole point. Though this is another reference to most of the things that's more Hellenistic in their view. They call the whole thing in the book of Luke the Feast of Unleavened Bread, even though it's split. That's just the way that they term the entire Passover as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it has those elements within it, which is the Fast of the Firstborn, Passover night, Sabbath morning, and then Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay, for the 7-day festival. So it's the whole festival. This lets you know that the person who's writing it is not Jewish and more Greekish than anything, because they're not really taking care to denote all those details that many Jews found very important in their retellings. So this is a Greek rendering of the story being related to Greek mindsets. And for them, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is equitable to an Easter that we know of. And so they're retelling it to us at a later period in time, and referring it to a terminology that we are familiar with, being that Easter, but it's actually their Passover or their Feast of Unleavened Bread from the Greek Hellenistic review. This kind of lets us know that we're talking and looking at a Hellenistic retelling of the events that occurred at that time period of the Jews. I hope you can follow me. Right? I'm trying not to make it very, very detailed into it. This is just the way Hellenists look at what happened at that time. And Easter didn't kick into an idea until it was the church was fully formed, right? So the term Easter here that we see isn't one that anyone would have used at that time period. Very interesting. I don't understand why they used that. They should just kept it the Passover, but whatever. Peter, therefore, was kept in prison, but prayer was made unto him. Prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. And when Herod would have brought him forth the same night, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly. And his chains fell off from his hands. And the angel said unto him, Gird thyself and bind on thy sandals. And so he did. And he saith unto him, Cast thy garment about thee and follow me. And he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. Okay. In other words, he's thinking that he's in a vision. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. Okay, this is a very interesting telling, because remember, it gives us I said earlier that the representation was from a later date, because we're talking about Easter, or at least mentioning Easter. Maybe it's a faux pas in writing, but it gives us an understanding of the time slice upon which the book of Acts was written and the mechanisms used to convey certain information to lead to conclusions that the church wished the believers to have. And one of those conclusions was for everyone to recognize that Jews are the mortal enemies of Christians at this time. They're the antagonists. They're the ones that are trying to stop the Christians from doing God's will, not necessarily the Romans. The reason we see this as Herod is because Herod was the Jewish antagonizer of the Christian church. One thing to note very clearly from a historical presentation, from a historical informational piece presentation that we know of historically, was that Claudius hated the Jews. Claudius couldn't stand the Jews. And so a lot of trouble and problems and persecution that the Jews went through and did was mainly to antagonize the Jews. And the Christians, if they antagonized the Jews, so be it, but they were still Jews. So Claudius really didn't care one way or another about it at all. Herod, at this time, would have seen a golden opportunity to get on the side of the church to persecute who they have always persecuted since the Hasmonean dynasty, Jews that they considered counter to the Jews they knew. in any Jewish group that was counter to the Jews that the Jews of the temple knew were considered the enemy to the Romans, and they would have allowed Herod to do whatever he needed to do to keep the peace. And so Herod going after the temple Jews targets would not have been a far stretch. They would have done that easily. They would have been, and the Roman government would have allowed them to do it. Herod would have had full power to do it. And so Herod going after the Christians would definitely be something that occurred. It would have been easier for them just to use the mechanical devices to develop the position that existed before, which was that the Pharisaic Jews weren't the protagonists, or were the protagonists. But here we see them really not really caring one way or the other about whether or not they were Pharisaic Jews or Sadducean Jews. It was simply the Jews against the apostles. And there's no difference between the two, because that's the concept that they had at a later period in time. That's why it's written in Easter, because it denotes the later period of the writing about what happened in 44 AD. They're using that time slice and this event to show, demonstrate how the Jews didn't want the Christian message to propagate. And contrary to their will, God did want the Christian message to propagate. And so he stepped in and interrupted their normal world for a miracle rescue of Peter out of prison. And this is the message that's being conveyed, that while the Jewish people don't want Christianity, God wants Christianity. And he's going to champion and do whatever needs to occur in our world, even if it goes against the normal operation of things in our world, to see the Christian church develop and grow. This is the message from a later date, using this time slice for that purpose. Got it? That's what this mechanism is. That's what this presentation is. Okay? And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, okay, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. Okay? So this is very interesting. Mary, the mother of John, John and James, the brothers, and one being the leader of the Nazarenes, and the other being the leader of the, I think it's the, let's see, one of the Nazarenes, I think the other one became leader of the Nazarenes too. Yeah, I think he took over. James and John both were the leaders of the Nazarenes. And this demonstrates that the group that was the earliest group of the apostles established by the groups would have been the Nazarenes. Very interesting. Where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken unto Rhoda. Came to hearken named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. In other words, she's like, hey, somebody's saying that they're Peter at the gate. And they said unto her, thou art mad. Why? Because once you get in that situation, you can't come out. He's dead. For everyone, as far as they were concerned, even though they were praying for his release, they were praying with an understanding of the impossibility of the event and in the stead. And so the demonstration is God can perform the impossible for his will to be made manifest amongst the believers of Christ. Okay. And they said unto her, thou art mad. But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then said they, it is his angel. Okay. Why would they do that? Of course he's dead. This is his angel, his other form. We don't have to respond because that form can't operate in this world. This is a very interesting perspective for the Christian church to have, because it's been promulgated throughout the ages when we see about ghosts and the spirits of our loved ones. We see them afterward, right? And we see their other form or their other angel. They're an angel, but we see their presentation. It's like it's here for a little while, but it'll go away and then it won't come back. Okay. It rises and then it goes up. And that rising is that angel that everybody sees, and then it goes on into heaven. So that's the resurrection that many of the early Gnostic groups held. That presentation. So the answer, and I've heard a lot of critical scholars state that at that time when Jesus had died and the devastation that they felt, that Jesus, when they saw him, they would have seen his form like that. It would have risen, they'd have seen it, and then it would have come back based upon that tradition of belief in that Gnostic group, in that Gnostic time period. And that's how they saw the forms. And that would be the explanation that would be wrapped into critiquing the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They just saw, they were devastated and they saw what they believed was Jesus, even though it wasn't. People saw a vision, right? So it wasn't them. It wasn't them. It was just their pain they saw. They saw their concern and their issues with what happened, the tragedy, and they saw that reoccur. But that's not what they're saying. This is a different concept. So I just thought that was it is his angel. That's where that comes from. It's a Gnostic concept. It's a Gnostic tradition. It's a Gnostic principle. It lets you know, yes, they were Gnostics. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. So they hear him knocking. But he beckoned unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, go, show these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. Okay. So he knew James had taken over from John. Okay. All right. So he's saying, let's see. Because if we go up early, let's see, because it said he had already killed James. Did Peter not know that James was dead? Huh? Did Peter not know that James was dead? Because he said, go show it to James. So did he not know James was already gone when he was put into prison? Probably not. Probably, who knows? Okay, this is a later rendering. So the time period, it's one of the things that I find very interesting about the book of Acts and their influences and the inferences that they write. James had died earlier, and John had taken over the Nazarenes. Peter goes into prison, comes out, and says, hey, tell James that I was rescued. And when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. Okay, went down lower. Okay, or I should say, actually, it went up from Judea. It went like over to Judea to Caesarea, and there went into it. Okay, it was a safe place. So that's that. That's Acts 12:19. There are a couple of things that lets us know that the later writers of Acts used a lot of what they believed at their time of writing and influenced this writing of Acts a little bit. There are things that don't match up in the book of Acts in this way. And there's a lot of things that don't match up in a lot of places, but they tell you a generalized story that God intended for the world to understand the Christian message. So now let's go into Acts 12:20. And Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. But they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus the king chamberlain their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country, which is Rome. Okay? So in other words, after a while, with the new king in place, Agrippa died, and now we've got Herod Causus, Herod of Causus. Then we see Herod Agrippa dies during the festival given for Claudius. There it is. And then the death of Herod. And Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. But they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus the king chamberlain, their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. Remember that battle that I said that occurred between Damascus and Herod had lost a lot of men in the first one, but Claudius came and backed them up. So after they had taken out the king or at least Rome began to fight against the Damascus and the Parthians, they decided to give peace a shot because they were both under the same rulership of Rome. Okay. And the people gave a shout saying, "It is the voice of a God and not a man." And he set a day, and upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. And the people gave a shout saying, "It is the voice of a God and not a man." And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost. But the word of God grew and multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and took with them John, whose surname was Mark. Okay? All right. The writer of this portion of Acts, and we just take it as it is. Historically, let's look at the timeline. Okay? We've got to straighten this out. Get this right. Herod is executed in 44 AD. Herod executes James, the brother of Jesus, in 44 AD. Peter gets put in prison that same year, 44 AD. Peter comes out of prison in 44 AD. Now, what time that all this occurred makes me wonder at the chronology steps of Acts 12. So if Peter's imprisonment happened before James was slain, this makes sense. Absolutely makes sense. And that's more than likely what happened. But the chronology steps that we have in Acts 12 doesn't follow that. It actually goes backwards. Herod dies is lower, but it's actually higher. Okay. Herod died in about 44 AD also. But the historical, let me give you the historical steps are Herod goes off to Rome and does what he needs to do. James is slain while Herod is gone. And when he comes back, the high priest killed James when Herod was gone. When Herod got back, he got angry at the Jews of the temple. So they kicked out the high priest of the temple and replaced him with another high priest to satisfy Herod and what he came when he came back to. Herod of Chalcis was in charge from 41 to 43. 41 to 43, he kicked in. About 41 to 43, he started. That was when Barnabas had began to move to Antioch earlier, and he went and picked up Saul from Tarsus, and they spent the year in Antioch. That's when Herod of Chalcis took over. Herod Agrippa, remember I said there are different Herods in different areas, right? Herod Agrippa wasn't the primary Herod anymore. He had moved over to the side. He wasn't that great one, but he was still friends with who was it? Was it Claudius? Yeah. He was still friends with Claudius and Caligula. So when he takes over and he's still on the side, he still has authority, but he doesn't have a primary authority. Chalcis does. So in his area where he's in charge of certain things, he can initiate certain things and interact with certain things and make certain things occur, because the reason why he moved was because he lost that battle. I mean, he lost a lot of men in that battle to the king of Damascus, and it was embarrassing. When he lost that battle and that power, the other house, Herod, just came over, and I'm claiming that space that Herod lost. He lost privilege. I'm in charge now. Herod was still alive. Herod Agrippa was, but he was demoted. And in that demoted state and in that demoted place, we see Herod very angry about everybody doing things while he's preoccupied. He's already lost the battle. He's been demoted, and he lost his status in Rome. His friendship with Caligula was still shaky. And now the Jewish temple people are operating as though he has no power. So he's rabbit mad. And so he begins over here to create issues in Judea, whereas Chalcis is in a different area of the Judean peninsula space and in charge of a different area, but running all of it as the primary for Rome, as the one that's supposed to give the money from the temple to Rome. And he's doing that. Chalcis is doing that. Herod is the one that can't do that anymore. So Agabus comes and he prophesies about the famine, and everyone's in Caesarea. Herod not Herod, but the guy's James is executed. And Agrippa, and Peter goes in prison, and Agrippa holds a festival thereafter. And at the festival that he's presenting to the people, to demonstrate to the people that he's still in charge, that he still has power, that he's still the one they need to look at. And so he has them proclaim, It is not the voice of a man, but the voice of God. In other words, he is the replacement for the Jews as their Messiah. He's the one. So from the Christian view, Herod has to go. He's already been demoted. He's already caused derision. And now he's proclaiming himself to be like Jesus, the Messiah, the man God to the Jews. In other words, he's trying to use the Jewish idea and the identity that the Christians had and had established Jesus as. Herod Agrippa takes that mantle and presents it to the Jewish people and says, you guys follow me like you follow Jesus. I'm the voice of God. I'm the Messiah. That's what he's saying in this last piece. That's why the Christians said, you've got to go. You're going to be swimming with the worms. You're done. Now, whether he actually died, because I believe he died a little bit earlier, but 44, 45, Herod dies in Shlez about maybe 44 AD. So everything happened between 43 and 44 AD. Most of that stuff, okay, in Acts chapter 12. No later than 46. So maybe for some of it, maybe 45 AD, between the time period of Paul's incarceration and freedom, not Paul, Peter's incarceration and freedom, which would have happened while James was alive, and James would have been presented to them. It would have been, let's see, maybe make sure the names, because now I get a little bit of somebody talking. So it's James. James. And James was killed in Acts 12 and 2. But Peter is asking and telling them to tell James in Acts 12 and 17. Okay. So James was more than likely alive when Peter went into prison. And the order of events that are being retold in Acts 12 are out of order. That's fine, as long as you put them back in place based upon the history that they came into. And we put them back in place by looking at the historical time periods that occurred historically based upon Josephus and other historians, which tells us that Herod executes James, the brother of Jesus, and the Nazarenes, or at least the high priest was executing or killed James in 44 AD. Okay. And in 44 AD, Peter goes into prison, and aid was sent, and Barnabas and Saul were in Antioch, and that area of Caesarea and Antioch, and Herod Agrippa dies during the festival given by Claudius. And that was March 16th of the year 44 AD. That's what I got here in my notes. So March 16th is when Herod supposedly died historically. So everything would have had to occur in 44 AD, but Passover is not until the end of the year. Closer to the end of the year, like November, after the fall, right before Pentecost, which would have been in the harvest, which would have been in about June, July. I think Pentecost is like in the middle, June, July, June, March, April, May, June. June, right? First in June. So if Pentecost is around first in June, and this was happening around that time period, it would have been June, not March. So Herod died in March. If Peter was in prison, James died that year sometime. James would have had to have died after Passover, or around Passover, which would have been in March, April, May. You said June? Yeah, June. Things aren't matching up. Things ain't matching up on the time period. I'll have to take a look into the time periods here, because the time slices for Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the historical date of Agrippa's death, which is March 16th in the year 44, 45. I'll take one. Let's say 45 would have been. I'll give it 45 because it's sort of a split. We don't really know. It's 44, 45. So if it's 45, March 16th, then yeah, it's all good. But if it's 44, it don't work. So, and I have a time spread between 44 to 46, between the time periods in which he died. So we'll call it 45. And that makes everything makes sense in 45. It can't be 44. 44, he could have gone into prison. That means James would have been alive. If James dies in the same year between 44, 45, it could have been later that year that James died, but Peter was already in prison earlier that year. Okay? So that could work. And that makes sense with the flow of time and the steps and steps and steps. So the chronology makes sense. So I'll go with that. That makes sense. All right. Okay. But like I said, the writing of the book of Acts and the timelines, we have to try and work with what we got as far as the time periods and the historical events. And as long as the historical events gives us a spatial amount of time, we could plug in the events that occurred within that spatial amount of time. And because no one was really there, we can kind of work with that space. And within that 44, 45, 46 time period is when we see a lot of things occurring, but not a lot of detailed information of the days and moments and times, other than Herod's death, because that's a hard set. We have the famine in 43, 44, and that's a hard set. That came from Josephus. The death of Herod came from Josephus, and some of the other historians. So those we can depend upon. But the things that happened between regarding the Acts, we know there are certain things that occurred because certain people were alive versus other people alive. So we'll work with that a little bit more. So we'll get into Acts chapter 13. I'll probably do a recap on Acts chapter 12 next week, and then kind of work on the steps, the stages of Acts chapter 12 a little bit more. Like I said, we got started a little bit late, so I didn't have a lot of things in place, but I'll get the things sort of narrowed down and chopped down based upon the history timeline, and then we'll move on to Acts chapter 13. And that would be that. Okay, thank you. All right, we're done. I'm gonna let you guys go. I appreciate your time and your placement and your patience, rather, for being with me. And we're going to be praying for each and every one of you in your places and at home, praying for your family. And we're going to close down. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate your time. Any questions? I know you should have some questions about this one. This one sort of, it seems a little scatterbrained because Acts 12 puts the events, the sequence of events backwards rather than forwards. But it's kind of within that 2 or 3 year time period, because the retelling doesn't really fit the historical events. It's someone speaking at a latter time, talking about what's happening at a previous time. And so things get sort of jumbled in there, but you get the gist of where they're going for it. All right. It happens sometimes in the Gospels and in the retelling and in Acts. We'll talk. There'll be a couple more when we get down into the writing in the epistles and the time periods of the epistles of Paul, where things don't kind of line up perfectly. They go backwards and they skip. They back around. So sometimes it's a challenge to make sure that we get where those lines are drawn, to try and make sense of them. But they do have very big significance. And the significance is in identifying the writer of that particular piece of information that was given for that book. You can tell whether or not they're Gnostic, Jewish rabbinical, or Jewish Gnostic. And that's a very, very important thing to determine, because it also sets the time period upon which the information in the book is covering. So, like I said, the book of Acts, Luke Acts, was written, I think they say a little bit later, about 80s or 90s. And it would have complemented the book of Mark. So Mark would have been written first, and then Acts would have been written later. So it's still later. So the book of Acts would probably have been written around the time period right before the book of Revelations would have been started. So they would have had the book of Acts, and then they would have started the book of Matthew later, and that would have been the third book. And the book of John came much, much later on the other side. So for the majority of the first 200 years, the main books that they had would have been the book of Luke, Acts, and Mark. And that would have been pretty much the gist of the amounts of books that they would have had, especially because of the fact that, who was it? Marcion, who was the first canonizer of the books, would have used all of Luke. And basically he said, Luke was the only book that you really need. As far as the Gospels, you don't need Matthew, you don't need Mark, you just need Luke. And he would have had Luke as his book. And that was about 220. Yeah, about 220, 250 that he had when Marcion was around. And that was when the books were being canonized. So good night. Appreciate your time. I thank you for being with us. And we're going to continue back into the book of Luke, Acts, when we get a chance. All right. God bless you. Bye-bye. I'm going to finish up. We'll start with Acts chapter 13. All right. Bye-bye. God bless you.